Hey guys, the strange thing about medieval beds is that they were not always bad because they were simple. Sometimes they were worse because they were doing too many jobs at once. They were furniture, storage, status symbols, family spaces, sickbeds, guest rooms, and in many homes, the only soft place a tired body could hope to find. Before we step into that world, tell me where you're watching from and what quiet corner of history you'd like us to explore next. If you enjoy thoughtful long-form history, a like is a simple way to support this kind of work. And if you want more calm, quietly fascinating history videos, you're warmly invited to subscribe. Now, let's begin with the uncomfortable truth. In the medieval world, a bed was not just where people slept. It was where the whole pressure of daily life often gathered after dark. To understand why medieval beds could be worse than modern viewers imagine, we first have to set aside the picture that usually comes to mind. The problem was not simply that everyone slept on a pile of straw and woke up miserable. Some people did sleep on straw. Some slept on sacks filled with chaff, reeds, wool, hay, or whatever material was cheap and available. Others, especially the wealthy, could sleep on feather mattresses, linen sheets, thick blankets, and carved wooden bed frames with curtains. Medieval sleeping arrangements were not all the same. They depended on money, region, climate, season, household size, and social rank. But that is exactly where the story becomes more interesting. The richer bed was not always the healthier bed. The humbler bed was not always the worst one in every possible way. And the thing modern people often misunderstand is that comfort in the Middle Ages was not just about softness. It was about warmth, dryness, cleanliness, privacy, safety, and the ability to stay asleep long enough for rest to mean something. A medieval bed might look, at first glance, like an ordinary domestic object. But in practice, it sat at the intersection of nearly every pressure in medieval life. It reflected how much space a household had, how much fuel it could burn, how often cloth could be washed, how close animals lived to people, how damp the walls were, how many relatives shared one room, and whether a family could afford even a small distance between the sleeping body and the floor. The bed was not isolated from the world outside. It absorbed that world. For poorer medieval families, the most basic sleeping place might be a pallet laid near the hearth or against a wall, sometimes raised only slightly, sometimes not raised at all. A sack stuffed with straw could feel like a blessing after a day of fieldwork, but straw was not a neutral material. It flattened, scratched, it held moisture. It could gather dust, mites, fleas, and smells from the household around it. If the straw was not changed often, the bed became less a soft refuge and more a slow collection of the week's discomforts. Yet even this needs nuance. Straw was not used because medieval people were foolish or careless. It was used because it was practical. It was available after harvest. It provided insulation from the cold floor. It was light enough to replace when possible. It gave shape to a mattress before industrial materials existed. In a world where most people owned very little, a stuffed sack could be a meaningful improvement over bare boards, packed earth, or rushes spread on the floor. What seems primitive to us often made sense inside the limits of the time. The trouble was that those limits followed people into the night. A modern bed is usually expected to offer separation from daily mess. In a medieval household, separation was much harder. Many people lived in one-room or two-room homes, where cooking, working, eating, storing tools, tending children, and sleeping happened close together. Smoke from the hearth could drift and settle. Damp air could creep in through walls and thatch. Mud from shoes, bits of straw, animal hair, ashes, and food smells all belonged to the same domestic atmosphere. So when a tired worker lay down, they were not entering a private zone of recovery. They were lowering themselves into the household's shared conditions. If the fire had burned low, the room could become bitterly cold. If the hearth smoked badly, Eyes and throats might remain irritated. If the roof leaked or the walls held moisture, bedding could feel clammy. If children, grandparents, servants, apprentices, or animals were nearby, sleep could be broken by movement, coughing, crying, snoring, or the restless noises of creatures kept close for warmth and security. This is one of the quiet reversals of medieval domestic life. The bed was meant to protect the body from hardship, but the bed itself could not escape hardship. Could be softer than the floor and still be unpleasant. Could be valuable and still be full of insects. It could be surrounded by curtains and still smell of smoke, wool, old linen, and unwashed bodies. Comfort existed, but it was fragile. Among wealthier households, beds could become impressive objects. A great bed might have a heavy wooden frame, a canopy, hangings, pillows, bolsters, blankets, coverlets, and curtains that enclosed the sleeper from drafts. These beds were not only practical, they were public statements of rank. In noble and wealthy urban homes, a bed could be one of the most expensive possessions a family owned. It might be listed carefully in wills and inventories. Fine bedding could be inherited, gifted, displayed, and moved. That sounds luxurious, and in many ways it was. Compared with a straw pallet near a smoky hearth, a feather bed with linen sheets was a real form of privilege. But medieval luxury often came with hidden burdens. Heavy fabric trapped warmth, which was useful in cold rooms, but it also trapped odors. Curtains shielded sleepers from drafts, but they could also reduce airflow. Feather mattresses were soft, but they could harbor pests if not maintained. Fine textiles required care, and washing large pieces of fabric was laborious. Cleanliness was not impossible, but it demanded time, labor, fuel, water, drying space, and servants. A rich person's bed could be grand, but not automatically fresh. Could be splendid and stale at the same time. And then there was the matter of sharing. Modern viewers often imagine the bed as intensely private. In the medieval world, privacy was less ordinary, less expected, and more dependent on status. Beds were shared by spouses, siblings, servants, travelers, children, and sometimes unrelated people when space was limited. Inns might place strangers in the same bed. Households might arrange sleeping according to rank, gender, obligation, and availability rather than personal comfort. The idea that every individual should have a separate bed in a separate room would have sounded unrealistic for much of medieval society. This sharing was not always seen as strange. Conserved heat, saved space. It reflected a culture in which bodies lived closer together. But it also meant that a bed could become crowded, restless, and socially awkward. A person might sleep next to someone who shifted, coughed, smelled, scratched, or carried lice. A child might sleep across adults. A servant might sleep near the work they were expected to resume at dawn. In colder months, closeness could be survival. In warmer months, it could be misery. That is one reason medieval beds were worse than they appear in simple comparisons. The discomfort was not only physical, it was social. The bed was a place where the boundaries of the self were thin. You did not always control who slept near you. You did not always control the hour you woke. You did not always control the sounds, smells, or movements around you. Rest was negotiated with the household. Even the design of the bed reveals this. Wealthier beds with curtains were not just decorative. They helped block drafts in rooms that were difficult to heat. They created a little chamber inside a chamber, a warm pocket in a cold house. In castles and manor houses, where stone walls could hold chill and large rooms could be difficult to warm, bed curtains were practical technology. They created insulation. They softened the air around the sleeper. They offered a hint of privacy in a world where servants, family members, Visitors and attendants might be nearby. But that small enclosed world could also become heavy. Imagine thick fabric pulled around a bed after a long winter day. The room outside is cold. The air inside is warmer, but still carries the traces of bodies, wool, smoke, and the bedding itself. The mattress may be soft, but it is not silent. The frame creaks. The ropes beneath the mattress may sag. The sleeper may be aware of insects in the seams, the weight of blankets, the closeness of another body, the fear that morning will arrive too soon. The phrase "sleep tight" is often connected in popular retellings with tightening rope beds, though the history of that exact phrase is more complicated than people sometimes claim. But rope-supported beds were real. Many bed frames used a network of ropes or cords to support the mattress. Over time, those ropes could loosen, causing the sleeping surface to sag. A sagging bed was not just uncomfortable. It could pull the body into an uneven hollow, especially when more than one person shared it. Tightening the ropes helped restore support, but it was another small maintenance task in a world already filled with maintenance. This is where medieval life often surprises modern listeners. Discomfort was not always caused by the absence of solutions. Sometimes the solutions existed, but they required constant effort. Straw had to be changed. Rushes had to be refreshed. Bedding had to be aired. Curtains had to be shaken. Mattresses had to be beaten. Ropes had to be tightened. Linen had to be washed. Fires had to be managed. Pests had to be endured or fought with whatever methods people had available. A bed was not a finished product. It was an ongoing responsibility. For ordinary households, this responsibility often fell into the larger rhythm of domestic labor, much of it performed by women and servants. The making of a bed was not simply pulling up a blanket. It could involve turning bedding, airing textiles, checking for damp, shaking out straw, mending torn cloth, and trying to keep sleeping materials away from dirt, animals, and insects. In a damp climate, even a decent mattress could become unpleasant if not dried properly. In a smoky interior, fabric absorbed the room. In a crowded home, bedding might be folded away or used for more than sleeping. And when sickness entered the household, the bed became something else entirely. It became a place of care, confinement, and contagion. A sick person might remain in the bed for days, sweating into bedding that could not be easily cleaned by modern standards. Family members might sleep nearby. Caregivers might sit close. The same bed that represented rest could quickly become a symbol of vulnerability. In a world without modern medicine, without modern sanitation, and without an easy supply of clean washable textiles, the sickbed was both necessary and frightening. Still, it would be wrong to imagine medieval people as helplessly surrounded by filth without any concern for cleanliness. They cared about freshness, order, and bodily comfort in ways shaped by their own knowledge and resources. Textiles were aired. Herbs and sweet-smelling plants could be used. Bedding was shaken out. Wealthier households had laundry systems. People understood that stale bedding was unpleasant, that fleas were irritating, that damp was harmful, that smoke and foul smells mattered. The gap between their world and ours was not a lack of human preference. It was a difference in tools, infrastructure, materials, and labor. This matters because the worst version of medieval history makes people in the past seem almost alien. But they were not alien. They wanted warmth. They wanted softness. They wanted safety. They wanted sleep. What makes the medieval bed so revealing is not that people tolerated discomfort because they did not know better. It is that they lived inside a material world where even the desire for comfort had to be fought for, maintained, paid for, or shared. In towns, beds carried a different set of pressures. Urban homes could be cramped, especially for artisans, apprentices, servants, and poorer laborers. A workshop might be close to the sleeping area. Goods might be stored near bedding. Apprentices might sleep in the master's house, sometimes in lofts, back rooms, or shared spaces. The bed, or whatever served as a bed, was tied to work discipline. Rising early was not optional. The body that slept in the household also belonged to the household economy. This made sleep part of the social order. Where you slept, what you slept on, and who slept near you all said something about your place. The master and mistress might have the best bed. Children, apprentices, servants, and poorer relatives took what remained. A guest could be honored with better bedding. A servant might sleep near a door, a kitchen, or a work area. Even at night, hierarchy did not disappear. It lay down with everyone. In rural homes, the same principle appeared in quieter forms. Sleeping near the hearth mattered because warmth mattered. Sleeping raised from the floor mattered because floors could be cold, dirty, and damp. Sleeping close to animals might seem unpleasant, but animals were valuable, vulnerable, and sometimes part of the household's warmth and security. The stable, byre, or animal area could be close enough for sounds and smells to enter the night. Again, what looks backward from a modern distance often had a practical logic. A cow, a pig, or a few chickens were not simply background details. They were part of survival. But practical logic did not make the bed comfortable. One of the most underestimated features of medieval sleep is the cold. Before central heating, before sealed windows, before modern insulation, night cold had a physical presence inside the home. In winter, the fire was precious. Fuel cost labor and money. A poor household could not always keep a warm fire burning all night. Stone, earth, timber, and thatch all behaved differently, but none created the kind of controlled indoor climate modern people expect. A bed's main job was not only softness. It had to defend the sleeper from air. This helps explain the value of curtains, canopies, blankets, fur coverings, wool textiles, and shared sleep. Warmth was not a background comfort. It was a central problem. The medieval bed was often an attempt to build a small climate around the human body. For the wealthy, that climate could be made with fabric, feathers, and enclosed frames. For the poor, it might be made with straw, wool, shared blankets, clothing kept on overnight, and proximity to other bodies. Here again, there is a contradiction. The things that kept people warm could also make them uncomfortable. Heavy bedding could press down. Shared warmth could become crowded heat. Curtains could trap stale air. Wearing clothes to bed could help against cold, but could also carry the dirt and sweat of the day into the sleeping place. There was rarely a perfect solution, only a balancing of problems. And then there were insects. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs belonged to the uncomfortable background of pre-modern life, though their presence varied by place, season, household, and circumstance. They were not limited to poverty, though poverty made them harder to control. A fine bed could still have pests. A crowded bed made transmission easier. Straw and textiles could shelter small creatures. The seams of mattresses, cracks in wood, folds of curtains, and layers of bedding all offered places to hide. The misery of this is easy to underestimate because it is small. It is not the grand violence of battle or plague. It is not dramatic. It is the tiny repeated irritation that steals sleep one moment at a time. A person who has worked all day lies down, only to scratch through the night. A child wakes. Someone shifts. The blanket is pulled. The room is cold. The straw pricks through. A flea bites. Sleep returns, then breaks again. For a channel like this, those small details are often where history becomes most human. They remind us that the past was not lived in clean categories like medieval warfare, or feudal society, or castle life. It was lived through tired eyes, cold feet, stiff backs, shared blankets, smoky rooms, and the hope that tomorrow's labor would be bearable if tonight offered just enough rest. Yet medieval beds were also emotionally important. They were not only miserable objects. They could be cherished, decorated, guarded, and remembered. A good bed was a form of security. A marriage bed could symbolize household formation. A bed in a will could represent affection or inheritance. Fine bedding could mark dignity. Even a modest pallet could be one of the few places where a person felt sheltered from rain, mud, and labor. That tension is essential. The bed could be precious and unpleasant at the same time. In noble households, the bed could even become political. The bedchamber was not always a strictly private bedroom in the modern sense. It could be part of a larger world of service, access, rank, and display. Important people received attendance. Clothing, washing, waking, and retiring could involve rituals of hierarchy. The grand bed stood inside a managed environment, where privacy was controlled rather than assumed. The higher someone rose, the more impressive the bed might become, but the less simple privacy they might enjoy. This is one of the stranger ironies of medieval status. The poor often lacked privacy because they lacked space. The powerful often lacked privacy because their bodies were surrounded by service and ceremony. Different causes, different conditions, but the same modern surprise. Being alone in a bedroom was not the universal expectation. So when we ask why medieval beds were worse than people think, the answer is not only found in straw, insects, or hard wooden frames. It is found in the way the bed belonged to a whole household system. The bed carried class, labor, climate, gender, illness, inheritance, hospitality, and social rank. It was where the body met the architecture of the age. And once we understand that, the ordinary act of lying down begins to look different. A medieval person did not simply go to bed in the modern sense. They entered a space shaped by the day's work, the season's weather, the household's wealth, the availability of fuel, the condition of textiles, the number of people under the roof, and the constant struggle to keep discomfort from taking over the night. The next layer is even more revealing, because medieval people did not always sleep the way modern people assume. The night itself could be divided, interrupted, watched, prayed through, worked around, and shared with fears that had very little to do with dreams. And once the candle went out, the bed became not just a place of rest, but a small island inside a dark, noisy, fragile world where sleep was never entirely guaranteed. And in that dark, noisy, fragile world, the night did not behave like the neat block of sleep modern people often imagine. Today, many of us think of sleep as something that should happen in one long private stretch, preferably in a quiet room, behind a closed door on a clean mattress with the temperature controlled and the outside world pushed away. Medieval people could certainly desire long, peaceful rest, but the structure of their nights was often more broken, more social, and more exposed to the rhythms of darkness. The candle going out mattered. Artificial light was expensive, limited, and practical rather than decorative for most households. A fire might glow low in the hearth, but it did not turn a room into a modern bedroom. When darkness settled over a medieval home, it changed the character of every familiar object. The bed, the chest, the stool, the hanging cloth, the tools near the wall, the sleeping forms of other people, all became shapes in a dim interior. The bed was supposed to offer security, but it could also heighten the awareness of everything uncertain around it. This is one reason sleep in the medieval world had a spiritual and emotional weight that can be hard to recover now. Night was not only a time of rest. It was a time when the household was vulnerable. Doors were barred. Fires were watched carefully or allowed to die down. Animals had to be secured. Tools and goods had to be protected. Children had to be settled. The sick had to be checked. And beyond the walls of the home, streets, fields, roads, forests, and yards became harder to read. Darkness made ordinary dangers feel larger. For some people, sleep may have come in stages. Historians have debated the details and the spread of what is often called segmented sleep, the pattern in which people slept for a first period, woke for a while in the deep of the night, and then returned to a second sleep before dawn. We should be careful not to turn this into a single universal rule for every person in every medieval region. Life varied too much for that. But it is clear that pre-modern nights were often more flexible than modern industrial schedules later became. Waking in the night was not always treated as a failure of sleep. It could be a normal interval, filled with prayer, quiet conversation, tending a fire, checking on children, relieving oneself, remembering dreams, or simply lying awake in the dark. That changes how we understand the bed. A medieval bed was not always a place where the body disappeared into silence for 8 uninterrupted hours. It could be a place of waiting. A person might wake to the creak of timber, the shifting of another sleeper, the cough of a child, the scratch of insects, the movement of an animal, the sound of wind around the roof, or a noise outside that had to be interpreted. In a world without electric light, without modern locks, without emergency services, and without easy separation from the environment, being awake in bed was part of the night's work. The bed held the sleeper, but it did not entirely release them from duty. That duty was especially visible in households where the hearth was central. Fire was comfort, food, warmth, and danger all at once. A well-managed hearth could make the difference between a tolerable room and a freezing one. But open flame also carried risk. Sparks, embers, dry rushes, wooden structures, thatch, cloth, and stored goods could create anxiety. In towns especially, where buildings were close together, fire was one of the great fears of domestic life. The warmth people needed at night could also threaten the home that sheltered them. So even the question of whether to keep warmth alive through the night involved trade-offs. Too little fire and the room chilled. Too much carelessness and the household risked disaster. The bed, lying somewhere within reach of that decision, was part of a larger system of caution. A sleeping person was not resting inside a sealed machine of comfort. They were resting inside a fragile arrangement of flame, fuel, timber, cloth, and human attention. For poorer families, the cold could be severe enough that people might sleep wearing some of their clothing. This was not simply a sign of dirtiness, as modern imagination sometimes frames it. It was a strategy. Clothing added insulation. Removing layers in a cold room could be unpleasant, even risky for comfort. But the strategy had costs. The garments worn through the day carried sweat, dust, field dirt, kitchen smoke, stable smells, and the ordinary residues of labor. Bringing those garments into bed meant bringing the day's environment into the sleeping space. Once again, a practical solution created another kind of discomfort. In better-off households, night clothes and linen might create a stronger boundary between day and sleep. But linen itself required labor. Washing was heavy work. Water had to be carried or accessed. Soap or lye had to be used. Large textiles had to be beaten, rinsed, wrung, dried, folded, and stored. Drying could be difficult in damp weather. A sheet was not just a sheet. It represented a chain of work usually invisible in the finished bed. The cleaner the bed appeared, the more labor stood behind it. This is easy to miss because modern comfort hides labor from view. We see clean bedding as normal. Medieval people saw clean bedding as valuable. They understood the pleasure of fresh linen, the dignity of a well-made bed, the relief of dry covers, the importance of airing cloth. But those things were not effortless. In many homes, they were seasonal, occasional, or dependent on the household's resources. A fresh bed could be a small domestic triumph. The same was true of softness. Softness was not only a matter of personal luxury. It could affect health, pain, and recovery. A laborer's body might carry aches from plowing, lifting, bending, hauling, weaving, grinding, carrying water, kneading dough, tending animals, or standing for long hours. A poor bed could make the body wake stiffer than it had lain down. A sagging rope bed might twist the back. A thin pallet might leave hips and shoulders against hard surfaces. Straw could shift away from pressure points. Shared bedding could force awkward positions. In the morning, the body might not feel restored so much as restarted. But the wealthy body was not free from discomfort either. A feather bed could be warm and soft, but it could also sink deeply, hold heat, and require regular care. Heavy coverings could feel oppressive. Curtains could create a private warmth, but not necessarily fresh air. In a world where ventilation, heating, and cleanliness had to be balanced without modern technology, comfort could become excessive in one direction and lacking in another. A noble sleeper could be cushioned and still restless. There is a quiet lesson there. The medieval bed was not divided into a simple ladder from miserable poor to perfectly comfortable rich. Wealth improved the odds of rest. It provided better textiles, better insulation, more space, servants, and more choices. But it did not erase the pre-modern environment. It did not eliminate insects, smoke, illness, damp, bad air, fire risk, shared chambers, or social obligation. It only changed how those pressures were managed. For travelers, the uncertainty became even stronger. To sleep away from home was to lose control over the bed almost completely. Medieval inns, hostels, monasteries, and private houses could offer lodging, but the quality varied widely. A traveler might share a room with strangers, share a bed with strangers, sleep near animals, sleep in a hall, or accept whatever bedding was available. The bed could carry the history of previous bodies. Blankets, straw, pallets, and mattresses passed through many uses. Hospitality was valuable, but it was not the same as comfort. Imagine a merchant arriving after a day on muddy roads, or a pilgrim exhausted from walking, or a messenger seeking a place before nightfall. The promise of a bed would be welcome. Any roof might feel better than rain. Any blanket might feel better than exposure. Yet the same bed could be crowded, stale, noisy, and alive with the discomforts of those who had used it before. Travel made the medieval bed feel less like a possession and more like a gamble. In monasteries and religious houses, sleep followed another kind of discipline. Monastic beds were often meant to be modest, orderly, and regulated. The point was not indulgent comfort but spiritual rhythm. Night could be interrupted by prayer, offices, bells, and communal schedules. Here, again, the bed was not simply a private refuge. It belonged to a system. The monk or nun slept within a timetable shaped by devotion, obedience, and the belief that the night itself could be offered to God. This religious dimension also touched ordinary households. Before sleep, people might pray. They might make signs of protection. They might think about dreams, temptations, death, illness, or the moral meaning of the day just passed. The bed was close to vulnerability, and vulnerability had spiritual meaning. To lie down was to surrender control for several hours. In a world where sudden illness, infant death, accidents, and violence were more present than they are for many modern viewers, sleep could carry an awareness of human fragility. This is not to say medieval people were constantly terrified. They were used to their world. They laughed, worked, loved, complained, adapted, and slept as people do. But the atmosphere of night was different. The boundaries between practical fear, religious imagination, and ordinary household concern were closer together. The bed sat right in the middle of those boundaries. Children experienced this world differently again. A child's sleeping place depended heavily on household wealth, age, gender, family size, and local custom. Some children slept with parents or siblings. Some slept with servants or other children. Babies required attention through the night, and infant care could break sleep repeatedly. Older children might be placed where warmth and supervision were available. A bed that seems overcrowded to us might have been the most practical way to keep children warm, safe, and near. But overcrowding also meant the night was rarely still. A child turned sideways. Someone pulled a cover. Someone whispered. Someone woke from a dream. Someone needed to be comforted. In a small home, one person's disturbance could become everyone's disturbance. Sleep was shared not only physically but acoustically and emotionally. The whole household heard what the night produced. Servants and apprentices also slept under conditions shaped by dependence. Their beds, if they had them, reflected their position. They might sleep in workspaces, lofts, kitchens, storerooms, or shared rooms. In wealthy homes, servants could be numerous, and their sleeping arrangements could be carefully ranked. In humbler homes, they might be fitted wherever space allowed. Their rest was often secondary to the needs of the household. If someone had to rise early to stir fires, prepare food, tend horses, open a shop, or begin labor before others woke, that person's bed was not a place of leisure. It was a pause before service resumed. This makes the medieval bed a useful way to understand power without needing a battlefield or a throne room. Power was present in who got the warmest place, who got the cleanest linen, who slept alone, who shared, who rose first, who maintained the bedding, and who had to accept discomfort silently. The night did not erase rank. It made rank intimate. Even within marriage, the bed carried meanings larger than sleep. It could be associated with property, fertility, lineage, household authority, and public recognition. A marriage bed was not merely romantic in the modern private sense. It belonged to family strategy, inheritance, alliances, and the continuation of the household. For noble families especially, the bed could become part of dynastic expectation. For ordinary families, too, it was tied to children, work, reputation, and domestic stability. At the same time, bedchambers could be places of negotiation, argument, care, and exhaustion. A married couple might share warmth and labor, but they also shared limited space, financial pressure, children, illness, and fatigue. The medieval bed could hold tenderness, but it could also hold duty. Like so much in the past, it refuses to remain one simple thing. And then there were the materials themselves, each carrying its own story. Wood for bed frames required carpentry, money, and space. Rope or webbing needed maintenance. Straw depended on harvest cycles. Wool blankets connected the bed to sheep, spinning, weaving, trade, and household production. Linen sheets came from flax, processing, spinning, weaving, bleaching, washing, and storing. Feathers came from birds and required collection and containment. A bed was a small gathering of the medieval economy. When a wealthy person lay under fine textiles, they were lying under the work of many hands. When a poor person lay on straw, they were lying on the agricultural world that shaped their year. The bed brought the field, the workshop, the animal yard, the laundry, the forest, and the marketplace into one object. It was domestic, but it was never isolated. This connection between bed and economy helps explain why beds were often valuable enough to appear in legal and inheritance records. People left beds and bedding to relatives. They counted them among household goods. They repaired and preserved them. A bed could outlast a person. Bedding could move from one generation to another. The sleeping place was part of family wealth, especially in a world where possessions were fewer and textiles could be expensive. That fact alone should change how we imagine medieval discomfort. People did not always suffer because they ignored beds. They suffered partly because beds mattered so much. A good bed was worth naming. A good blanket was worth keeping. A mattress was worth maintaining. A clean sheet was worth labor. The bed was precious because proper rest was difficult to secure. There is another detail that modern viewers often overlook: the height of the bed. Raised beds were not merely elegant. Being lifted from the floor could protect sleepers from cold, damp, dirt, and some pests. Floors, especially in poorer homes, could be packed earth, covered with rushes, straw, or other materials that gathered debris. A raised sleeping surface created separation. Even a small lift mattered. For those who could afford substantial bed frames, the elevation itself was a form of comfort and status. But height also made the space under the bed useful. Storage was important in cramped households. Chests, bedding, tools, clothing, or other items might be kept nearby or beneath. Again, the bed did more than one job. It was not just a sleeping platform. It was part of the household's organization. And the more jobs it performed, the less purely restful it became. In castles and elite houses, the bed might occupy chambers that were part of a sequence of rooms, each controlling access to the important person within. The closer one came to the bedchamber, the closer one came to power. But that closeness meant the bed was connected to public life. People might be admitted or excluded according to rank. Servants might handle garments and bedding. Attendants might be present at waking and retiring. The bed was private enough to be intimate, but public enough to be political. For kings and queens, this could become even more pronounced. The royal bed was not merely a place to sleep. It symbolized continuity, legitimacy, fertility, and the body of rule. The bedchamber could be a place of ceremony and access. This does not mean every moment was public in the same way, or that medieval rulers had no private life at all. But it does mean that the modern idea of the bedroom as a sealed personal sanctuary does not fully fit. The higher the rank, the more the body could become a matter of household, court, and state. Yet when night came, even a ruler still had a body. They could still be cold. They could still be sick. They could still itch, sweat, wake, worry, or struggle to sleep. The finest bed in a kingdom could not remove the basic vulnerability of lying down in darkness. It could surround that vulnerability with silk, linen, servants, carved wood, and ceremony, but it could not abolish it. That may be the deepest reason this subject holds attention. The bed is one of the few historical objects that instantly connects the grand and the ordinary. Everyone sleeps. Everyone understands the desire for warmth and softness. But the medieval bed shows how unevenly those desires were answered, and how much of life's structure followed people into their most vulnerable hours. As the night deepened, the medieval household settled into layers of partial rest. Some bodies slept heavily from exhaustion. Some woke and listened. Some shifted under rough covers. Some lay enclosed behind curtains. Some stayed close to the fire. Some slept beside children. Some slept beside strangers on the road. Some servants rested lightly because work would call before dawn. Some sick people turned on damp bedding while others kept watch nearby. The bed gathered all of them into the same historical question. What did comfort mean when the world itself was hard to separate from? And before morning could bring answers, it brought demands. Long before the day fully brightened, someone had to rise. Fires had to be coaxed back to life. Animals had to be fed or checked. Water had to be fetched. Bread, pottage, ale, tools, carts, shops, fields, kitchens, and workshops began pulling people out of whatever rest they had managed to claim. The bed that had seemed so necessary in the dark now had to be left behind, still warm in places, still holding the shape of tired bodies, while the household stepped back into labor and the whole uneasy cycle of medieval sleep prepared to begin again. And that cycle began again not in the softness of night, but in the cold practical hour when the bed stopped being a refuge and became one more object to manage. The first person awake did not rise into comfort. They rose into the residue of the room. The low ash of the hearth, the chill that had gathered in corners, the smell of damp wool or smoke, the quiet disorder left by sleeping bodies. A blanket might have slipped to the floor. Straw might have worked its way through a seam. A child might still be curled into the warmest hollow. Someone older might wake slowly, stiff from a night spent on uneven support. Before the day's labor even began outside, the sleeping place had already created work inside. In many households, the bed had to be restored to order because the room itself was needed for other things. Modern bedrooms can remain bedrooms all day, but medieval domestic space was often too valuable for that. Pallet might be rolled or pushed aside. Bedding might be shaken, folded, aired, or hung near a warmer place if the weather allowed. A bench, chest, or floor area used for sleeping at night might return to work or storage by morning. The bed did not always sit apart from daily life. It had to make way for it. This constant conversion of space tells us something important about medieval rest. Sleep was not protected by architecture in the way many modern people expect. In a small house, there was rarely a clean division between the place of rest and the place of labor. The same air that held the smell of cooking held the smell of bedding. The same floor that supported tools, shoes, animals, and children also supported sleep. The bed was not surrounded by silence. It was surrounded by necessity, and necessity shaped even the materials chosen for comfort. Straw, for example, was not a single fixed experience. Fresh straw could be springy, clean-smelling, and surprisingly effective as insulation. Old straw could become flat, dusty, broken, damp, and unpleasant. The difference between a tolerable bed and a miserable one might depend on how recently the stuffing had been changed, whether the household could spare the material, whether the season made replacement easy, and whether pests had already found their way into it. For families close to agriculture, bedding materials were tied to the harvest calendar. Straw was not merely bedding. It was also fodder, thatching material, flooring material, packing material, and part of the wider economy of rural survival. A poor household could not always treat bedding as disposable. What the body wanted at night had to compete with what animals, roofs, floors, and storage required during the day. Comfort was part of a negotiation with scarcity. This is why medieval beds were sometimes worse than their appearance suggests. A straw mattress might look simple, but the problem was not only simplicity. It was the difficulty of keeping simple things fresh. A wooden bed frame might look sturdy, but the support beneath could loosen. Fine curtains might look elegant, but they could hold smoke. Feather bedding might sound luxurious, but it needed care and could become heavy with use. The medieval bed often failed not because people lacked ideas about comfort, but because every solution was vulnerable to time, moisture, labor, and cost. In damp regions, moisture was one of the most persistent enemies of rest. A bed could be cold not simply because the room was cold, but because the bedding itself had absorbed damp from the air. Wool could hold warmth even when conditions were poor, but damp wool had its own smell and weight. Linen could feel fresh when clean and dry, yet unpleasant when clammy. Straw could draw moisture from floors or walls if placed badly. A bed near a wall might suffer from drafts or dampness. A bed too near the fire might face smoke, sparks, and heat. Placement mattered, but in cramped homes there might be no perfect place to put it. The floor, too, mattered more than modern viewers often imagine. A raised bed did not merely signal status. It changed the sleeper's relationship to the coldest part of the room. Packed earth floors could hold damp. Floors strewn with rushes or straw might soften a space, but they also collected debris over time. In wealthier interiors, boards, tiles, and coverings could improve conditions, but they did not create the sealed cleanliness of modern flooring. To sleep low was to be closer to moisture, dirt, insects, and the drafts that moved near the ground. This explains why elevation had emotional value. To climb into a raised bed, even a modest one, was to leave the floor behind. It created a small symbolic ascent from the working world of mud, ash, tools, and feet into a more protected space. The difference might be only a few inches or a couple of feet, but in medieval conditions that could matter. The body did not need luxury to feel relief. Sometimes it only needed distance from the ground. But even raised beds required maintenance, and maintenance had its own quiet history. A rope bed could loosen, wooden joints could creak or weaken, mattresses could shift, textiles could tear, pillows could flatten, curtains could fray. Repairs depended on skill, time, and materials. In a world before cheap mass production, a bed was not easily replaced. It was preserved, patched, tightened, restuffed, inherited, and adapted. The bed carried age in its frame and fabric. That age could make it intimate, but also unpleasant. Bedding passed between generations might hold family memory, but it also carried use. A blanket might be beloved because it had warmed many winters. It might also be thin, smoky, and rough from years of washing and wear. A mattress might be valuable because it was expensive. It might also be difficult to clean thoroughly. Medieval households lived among objects that stayed with them. The bed was one of the most personal of those objects, and one of the hardest to keep truly separate from the past. Among the wealthy, inventories reveal how seriously bedding was valued. Sheets, coverlets, pillows, bolsters, featherbeds, blankets, hangings, and bed curtains could be counted, described, and passed on. The language of household goods often gives the bed a seriousness that surprises us. A bed was not just furniture. It was wealth in textile form. It was warmth stored against winter. It was hospitality prepared for guests. It was status made visible. It was also evidence of how much labor a household could command. The grander the bed, the more people were often involved in making it usable. Servants might air bedding, beat mattresses, hang curtains, tend fires, prepare chambers, and launder linen. A noble bed looked serene because work had been arranged around it. The sleeper's comfort rested on other people's labor. Even the peaceful image of a canopy bed in a quiet chamber hides a larger system of hands carrying water, managing smoke, brushing rushes, mending textiles, and controlling access to the room. For the poor, the work was more direct. There were fewer servants to absorb discomfort. The person who slept on the bedding might also be the person who gathered straw, patched cloth, shook out blankets, and rose before dawn to begin the next round of labor. If pests appeared, there was no simple solution. If the mattress became damp, there might be no spare. If a child wet the bed, if illness soaked the sheets, if rain entered the roof, if smoke settled into every cloth, the household had to cope with what it had. And this brings us to one of the more uncomfortable truths about medieval beds. They were closely tied to the body in ways modern bedding tries to hide. Sweat, breath, hair, skin, illness, childbirth, infancy, old age, intimacy, and death could all pass through the bed. The medieval bed was not a sterile nightly platform. It was a place where the body's full vulnerability appeared. People were born near beds, conceived in beds, recovered in beds, suffered fevers in beds, and sometimes died in beds. That range gave the bed emotional weight. A bed could be associated with care and tenderness, but also with fear. To be confined to bed through sickness was serious. Without modern medical treatment, a long stay in bed could mean uncertainty for the entire household. Bedding might become soiled. The sick person might need warmth, liquids, prayer, attention, and quiet that the household could barely provide. The bed became a center of concern. It drew people to it and warned them away at the same time. Childbirth made this even more vivid. In many medieval households, birth took place in domestic space, with women attending, cloth prepared, warmth maintained, and the bed or nearby area transformed into a place of risk and hope. The same object used for ordinary sleep could become part of one of the most dangerous and meaningful events in family life. Afterward, bedding might need cleaning, airing, or replacing if possible. The bed returned to ordinary use, but it had held something extraordinary. Death, too, often came close to the bed. A dying person might be laid in bed, watched by relatives, clergy, or neighbors. Prayers might be said. Last words might be heard. The bed could become a threshold between household life and eternity. To modern viewers, who often experience death in hospitals or care facilities, the medieval bed's closeness to death may feel startling. But in that world, the domestic and the mortal were not so neatly separated. The bed was where the body retreated when it could no longer stand. This made bed linens and coverings more than simple household goods. They touched the boundaries of purity, care, status, and memory. A fine sheet might serve a guest one season and a sick relative another. A blanket might comfort a child and later cover the dying. A bed might be inherited after the death of its owner. Objects remained, carrying associations that could be tender or uneasy. Yet daily life kept moving. The same bed that witnessed illness or birth might later be shaken out, remade, and used again. Medieval households did not have the luxury of discarding everything touched by difficulty. They cleaned what they could, repaired what they could, blessed what they believed needed blessing, and continued. The bed's endurance was part of its value and part of its discomfort. There is also the matter of smell, which may be one of the hardest historical realities to imagine accurately. Modern homes are full of artificial freshness, ventilation systems, detergents, sealed windows, bathrooms, and separate rooms for different bodily functions. Medieval interiors were sensory worlds of smoke, animals, wool, damp, cooked food, rushes, leather, sweat, stored grain, and sometimes waste. The bed absorbed this atmosphere. Even clean bedding existed within a scented environment. This does not mean every medieval bed smelled unbearable. That would be too easy and too false. People aired rooms, used herbs, managed rushes, washed linen, valued pleasant smells, and disliked foulness. But the baseline of smell was different. Smoke was common. Wool and leather had their presence. Bodies worked hard. Washing bedding was demanding. In winter, closed interiors and heavy textiles could hold odors longer. A bed might smell of the house itself, and the house might smell of the whole economy that sustained it. For medieval people, this was ordinary. For us, it reveals how much modern comfort depends on separation. Separate bedroom, separate bathroom, separate laundry, separate animal space, separate kitchen ventilation, separate heating system, separate storage. Medieval life often compressed these functions into a tighter world. The bed received the consequences of that compression. Privacy suffered from the same compression. Even in households with chambers, the idea of uninterrupted personal solitude was limited. People came and went. Servants entered. Children slept nearby. Guests were housed. Apprentices belonged to the household. A bed with curtains could create a boundary, but a fabric boundary is not the same as a locked private room. Sounds passed through. Smells passed through. Duties passed through. The curtain gave a person a small chamber of darkness, not complete escape. This is one reason the medieval bed can feel oddly theatrical. It was often covered, draped, enclosed, displayed, entered, and witnessed. It could hide the sleeper while also announcing wealth. It could create modesty while drawing attention to the owner's rank. A great bed in a chamber was both intimate and public, both practical and symbolic. It protected the body, but it also staged the body's importance. In humbler homes, there was less staging and more improvisation. A bench might become a bed. A chest might stand beside a pallet. A cloak might become an extra cover. A child might be moved closer to warmth. A visitor might be fitted into whatever space remained. At night, the household became a puzzle of bodies and blankets, arranged according to temperature, rank, age, and exhaustion. The arrangement might change by season, illness, or necessity. Winter sharpened every decision. In cold weather, people might cluster near the hearth or within curtained beds. Bedding became a defense against the air. The body curled inward, breath condensed in cold rooms. Getting out of bed could be the hardest moment of the morning, especially when the floor was cold and the fire had died low. The desire to remain under covers must have been powerful, but survival required rising. Animals did not wait. Work did not wait. Hunger did not wait. Summer brought different problems. Warmth was less precious, but insects could be worse. Stale air inside bed curtains could become uncomfortable. Shared sleep could feel oppressive. Workdays were long. Dawn came early. In agricultural communities, the season of growth and harvest demanded labor that could leave bodies deeply tired. A bed in summer might be less a warm refuge and more a place where the exhausted body negotiated heat, pests, and the pressure of early light. So medieval beds changed with the year. They were not static objects in a static room. They belonged to seasonal life. Winter emphasized cold, fuel, damp, and heavy covers. Summer emphasized ventilation, insects, labor fatigue, and early rising. Spring and autumn carried mud, changing temperatures, and the management of stored bedding. The bed was part of the calendar. It was also part of the moral imagination. Medieval religious and medical writings often treated sleep as necessary but potentially dangerous if excessive, disorderly, or indulgent. Too much softness could be morally suspect in certain contexts, especially for those who valued discipline, humility, or spiritual vigilance. At the same time, too little rest weakened the body and disturbed the mind. Sleep sat between need and temptation. A bed could be a place of restoration, but also of laziness, lust, illness, or spiritual vulnerability, depending on who was describing it. This tension shaped attitudes toward comfort. Not everyone believed the best bed was the softest possible bed. Monastic ideals, moral instruction, and medical advice could all warn against excess. Yet in practice, people still sought warmth and ease. The body's needs could not be preached away. A noble might be criticized for luxury, but luxury remained desirable. A monk might sleep simply, but still need enough rest to rise for prayer. A laborer might have no moral anxiety about softness at all, only too little access to it. Medical ideas added another layer. Medieval medicine, influenced by humoral theory, cared about heat, cold, moisture, dryness, digestion, sleep, and the balance of the body. The conditions of rest mattered. A room that was too cold, bedding that was too damp, sleeping too soon after eating, sleeping in certain positions, or being exposed to bad air could all be understood as affecting health. Some of these ideas differ from modern medicine, but they show that medieval people were thinking carefully about the relationship between sleep and the body. They may not have understood germs as we do, but they understood that air could be bad, damp could be harmful, foul smells were troubling, and bodily states changed with environment. The bed was therefore part of health management. It was where the body restored itself, digested, dreamed, sweated, and sometimes declined. A bad bed was not merely inconvenient. It could be interpreted as part of a wider disturbance in the body's balance. Dreams themselves mattered. A medieval person waking in the night might not dismiss a dream as random brain activity. Dreams could be interpreted spiritually, morally, medically, or emotionally. Some were feared, some ignored, some remembered. The bed was where images arrived from somewhere beyond ordinary waking control. In the darkness, after prayer, after pain, after hunger, after a day of labor, the sleeper entered a mental world that medieval culture took seriously. That makes the bed a place of imagination as well as fatigue. It held the sleeping body but also the dreaming mind. In a dark room, behind curtains or under rough covers, a person might dream of saints, demons, lost relatives, work, hunger, fear, desire, or the ordinary anxieties of the day. The night magnified what daylight kept busy. The bed did not only support rest. It opened the mind to a realm medieval people often treated with caution. And when morning came, those dreams might be spoken aloud, remembered quietly, or forgotten under the pressure of chores. A servant with an unsettling dream still had to rise. A mother who had barely slept still had to tend children. A field worker with aching joints still had to go out. A noble troubled by dreams still entered the duties of rank. Sleep, whether good or poor, did not excuse most people from the day. This is why the medieval bed, for all its symbolism, was finally judged by a very plain standard. Did it allow the body to continue? Not flourish in the modern wellness sense, not optimize rest, not create perfect comfort, but continue. Could the worker rise? Could the child stay warm? Could the sick person endure? Could the household survive another winter night? Could the traveler regain enough strength to walk again? Could the servant wake in time? Could the mother rest between interruptions? Could the old person find a little relief? The answer was often yes, but only partly. The bed helped. It was necessary. It was cherished. And still, it failed again and again in small ways. It scratched, sagged, smelled, chilled, crowded, overheated, concealed pests, absorbed illness, and demanded labor. Its failures were not always dramatic, but they were intimate. They touched the skin. As the medieval day unfolded, the bed waited in the background, stripped of its nighttime importance. Bedding might hang near air or light. Curtains might remain drawn back. Straw might be adjusted. A chest might be opened. Children might play too near it. A servant might carry linen away. A woman might check for damp. A man might tighten a frame or ignore it until the sag became impossible. The bed was quiet during the day, but it was never irrelevant. By evening, every unresolved problem would return. The smoke would settle again. The cold would creep again. The insects would stir again. The bodies would gather again according to habit and hierarchy. The same blankets would be pulled up. The same curtains might close. The same floor would hold the same damp. The same household noises would soften into darkness. And just before sleep took hold, the medieval bed would once more become what it had always been, the most desired place in the house and one of the least perfect. But to understand the worst of it, we still have to look more closely at the creatures and conditions that shared the bed with the sleeper, because the medieval night was not occupied by human beings alone. In the folds of cloth, in the seams of mattresses, in the straw beneath tired backs, and in the cracks of wooden frames, another hidden world could thrive quietly until the room darkened and the bodies lay still. That hidden world was small enough to be overlooked in grand histories, but large enough to disturb almost every hour of rest. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were not dramatic forces in the way kings, battles, famines, or plagues were dramatic. They did not announce themselves with banners or dates. They worked quietly, close to the skin, in the places where people most wanted peace. And because they lived in the same domestic materials that made sleep possible, they were difficult to separate from the bed itself. The discomfort was not limited to the poor, though poverty made it harder to escape. A straw pallet could harbor pests. but so could a fine mattress if it was not carefully maintained. A wooden bed frame might look solid and clean from a distance, yet its cracks and joints could shelter insects. Curtains that kept out drafts could also create still, warm spaces. Heavy blankets could hold traces of bodies. Feather bedding could be prized and troublesome at the same time. In the medieval home, the very materials that promised warmth and softness could also create shelter for unwanted life. This is one of the quiet ironies of pre-modern comfort. The more layered a bed became, the more places there were for problems to hide. A simple pallet on the floor had its own hardships, but it could sometimes be replaced or shaken out more easily. A grand bed with hangings, bolsters, curtains, covers, and a deep mattress offered greater warmth and dignity, but it also demanded more vigilance. Luxury increased comfort, but it also increased the number of things that had to be cleaned, aired, beaten, brushed, folded, watched, and repaired. Medieval people were not unaware of this. They knew that bedding could become infested. They knew that stale straw should be changed when possible. They knew the relief of airing cloth in sun and wind. They knew that certain smells, plants, powders, and household practices might help discourage pests or at least make a bed more bearable. The problem was not ignorance alone. The problem was that domestic life created an endless invitation for small creatures to return. Animals made this worse, though again, not because medieval households were foolish. Animals were useful, valuable, and sometimes essential to survival. Dogs, cats, chickens, pigs, horses, cattle, and other animals occupied human environments in different ways depending on class and region. A poor family might live much closer to its animals than a modern viewer expects. A town household might have stables, yards, or work animals nearby. Fleas and lice moved through this shared world. The boundary between human sleeping space and animal life was often thin, especially in colder or poorer conditions. Even clothing carried the problem. People did not always have many changes of garments. Washing clothes and bedding was laborious. Wool, linen, leather, and fur all behaved differently, but all could hold dirt or pests if circumstances allowed. A person might go to bed wearing garments for warmth, bringing the day's contact into the night. A servant who worked near animals might sleep near other servants. A traveler might bring pests from one lodging to another. A child might carry lice through a household. The bed was only one part of a larger network of contact. Once we see that network, the medieval bed becomes less like a single object and more like a meeting place. It gathered the field, the stable, the road, the market, the laundry, the body, the hearth, and the household into one small area. The sleeper lay down in the middle of connections they could not fully control. The irritation that followed might seem minor from a distance, but for the person trying to sleep, it could become the difference between real rest and a night of broken exhaustion. The most frustrating discomforts are often the ones that do not fully wake us, but never let us sleep deeply either. A small bite, a scratch, a shift in the blanket, a child stirring, another sleeper moving because they too are uncomfortable. The bed creaks, the straw rustles, someone sighs in the dark. A dog turns near the hearth. The room settles again. Then the irritation returns. By morning, the household has technically slept, but the body knows it has not been restored. This kind of suffering rarely leaves a clear record. Medieval chronicles were unlikely to pause and describe every bad night caused by fleas. Legal documents do not usually list the number of times a laborer woke under a rough blanket. Household accounts may mention bedding, laundering, repairs, or purchases, but they do not give us every sensation. The historian has to read the bed through materials, medical writings, inventories, moral advice, domestic practice, archaeology, literature, and the logic of daily life. The result is not a cartoon of constant misery, but a more grounded picture. Rest was possible, sometimes deeply welcome, but it was fragile. That fragility helps explain why the care of bedding mattered so much. Shaking bedding was not merely tidying. Beating a mattress was not merely house pride. Airing a blanket was not decorative. Changing straw when possible was not a small matter. These actions were part of the struggle to protect sleep from the household's creeping disorder. A bed left entirely alone would decline. It would gather moisture, dust, insects, smells, and wear. Comfort had to be renewed. In wealthier homes, this renewal was built into service. Servants could strip bedding, hang textiles, brush hangings, and prepare chambers. Linen could be laundered more often. Mattresses could be tended. Rooms could be kept more controlled. But control was never perfect. The larger the house, the more textiles it might contain. The more servants and guests moved through it, the more contact occurred. The more impressive the bed, the more complex its care became. A grand household could fight discomfort with resources, but it also produced discomfort through scale. In poorer homes, renewal depended on direct labor and seasonal opportunity. A sunny day mattered. A dry breeze mattered. Access to clean straw mattered. Time mattered, but time was scarce. A household that needed every hand for fieldwork, food preparation, mending, childcare, and animal care could not treat bedding as a constant project. A mattress might remain imperfect because there were simply too many other urgent demands. The bed was important, but importance did not always move it to the front of the day. There is something deeply human in that. Many medieval people probably understood quite well what would make their beds better. Fresher straw, cleaner linen, drier rooms, fewer pests, more space, better ventilation, stronger frames, more blankets in winter and lighter covers in summer. But wanting these things was not the same as having them. The bed reveals the gap between knowledge and means, between preference and possibility. The remedies people used varied. Herbs and aromatic plants might be placed with bedding or strewn in rooms to improve smell or discourage pests. Rushes and floor coverings could be refreshed. Textiles could be exposed to air. Bedding could be shaken outside. Some households used strong scents, smoke, or plant materials. Others relied on manual cleaning and replacement. Not every method worked equally well, and not every household had equal access to supplies, but the effort itself shows that medieval people treated the bed as something that needed active defense. This also tells us something about smell again, because scent was not only about pleasure. Pleasant plants could signal order, care, and health. A bed that smelled fresher was not just nicer, it felt more controlled. In a world where foul air was often linked to illness in medical thinking, improving the atmosphere around the bed could feel protective. The sweetened bedchamber, the aired sheet, the shaken cover, the fresh rushes underfoot. These were small attempts to make the night less hostile. Still, the struggle never ended. Pests returned because people returned. Damp returned because weather returned. Smoke returned because heat and cooking required fire. Dirt returned because work happened in fields, yards, kitchens, stables, and streets. The household was not a museum to be cleaned once and preserved. It was alive, and because it was alive, the bed was always being pulled back toward disorder. This is where the medieval bed becomes more than a subject of discomfort. It becomes a lens into the limits of pre-modern domestic control. Modern comfort often depends on systems we barely notice. Piped water, cheap soap, washing machines, synthetic mattresses, sealed windows, central heating, vacuum cleaners, insect control, private rooms, smooth floors, regular waste removal, electricity, and mass-produced bedding. Remove those systems, and even familiar tasks become large. Cleaning a bed becomes labor. Keeping it dry becomes strategy. Keeping it pest-free becomes a campaign with no final victory. For medieval people, sleep existed inside that campaign. It was not simply a biological event. It was a household achievement. A person slept well when the roof held, the room stayed tolerable, the bedding remained dry, the insects were few, the fire behaved, the children settled, the animals quieted, the body was not too hungry or sick, and the demands of the next day did not press too heavily on the mind. Many things had to go right for rest to feel complete, and many things could go wrong without becoming a crisis large enough to record. A damp blanket was not a historical event. A sagging rope was not a public disaster. A night of scratching did not change a kingdom, but repeated over years, these small discomforts shaped bodies, moods, marriages, work, illness, and the emotional texture of ordinary life. They made fatigue normal. They made a good night memorable. They made a clean, warm bed feel like a blessing. That blessing could carry social meaning. To offer someone a bed was not always a simple courtesy. Could be an act of hospitality, rank, charity, or obligation. A guest given good bedding was being honored. A traveler received into a household was being protected from the dangers of night. A poor person allowed space near warmth might survive whether that could otherwise be dangerous. The bed's discomfort did not cancel its value. In fact, because rest was difficult, hospitality around sleep became more meaningful. In inns, this could become complicated. A bed might be shared not because the innkeeper was unusually cruel, but because space was limited and lodging customs were different. Travelers expected discomfort in ways modern hotel guests usually do not. A place to lie down under a roof could still be worth payment. But shared beds meant shared warmth, shared odors, shared pests, and shared risk. A stranger's blanket could become part of your night. A mattress could carry traces of unknown roads. For pilgrims, merchants, students, soldiers, laborers, and messengers, the uncertainty of lodging made the home bed more precious, even if home was humble. A familiar bed may not have been clean by modern standards, but familiarity mattered. You knew its sag. You knew who slept beside you. You knew the sounds of the room. You knew where the cold came in. You knew how close the hearth was. You knew what discomforts belonged to your own household and which belonged to strangers. That familiarity is easy to underestimate. Comfort is not only softness. It is also predictability. A poor medieval sleeper might endure straw, smoke, and crowding, yet still prefer their own rough bedding to an unknown bed in an inn. A noble might travel with bedding or expect households to provide suitable arrangements because rank demanded continuity of comfort. The more uncertain the road, the more powerful the idea of one's own sleeping place became. Beds could even travel in a literal sense among the wealthy. Portable bedding, hangings, and furnishings could accompany important households as they moved between residences. This seems strange only if we imagine a bed as fixed furniture. For medieval elites, household movement was common. Courts, nobles, bishops, and wealthy families might shift from one estate to another. Bedding moved because comfort, status, and ceremony had to be recreated wherever the household went. The bed was not just an object in a room. It was part of a mobile identity. For ordinary people, mobility was different. Their beds were less likely to move with them, but sleeping arrangements still changed with work, travel, service, marriage, and season. A young servant leaving home might exchange a family sleeping place for a pallet in someone else's household. An apprentice might sleep near a workshop for years. A newly married couple might acquire bedding as part of setting up a household. A widow might inherit or lose access to a bed depending on property and family arrangements. The sleeping place was tied to life stages. This makes the bed a quiet witness to social transition. Childhood, service, marriage, illness, widowhood, old age. Each could change where and how a person slept. A child who once slept among siblings might be sent into service and sleep under another roof. A bride might bring textiles or bedding into a marriage. An elderly relative might be given a place near warmth or pushed into a marginal corner. Depending on the household's resources and relationships, the bed recorded belonging. But belonging did not always mean ease. A crowded family bed could express closeness and necessity at once. A servant's pallet could mean shelter and dependence at once. A noble bedchamber could mean privilege and surveillance at once. The medieval bed keeps refusing simple categories. It was warm and stale, valuable and infested, private and public, loving and disciplinary, protective and imperfect. And beneath all of this was the constant problem of cleaning without modern infrastructure. Laundry was one of the great hidden labors behind sleep. Linen sheets, where available, could be washed, but washing took strength. Water was heavy. Heating water required fuel. Soap or cleaning agents had to be made or obtained. Rinsing and drying took time and space. In cold or wet weather, drying could be slow. A household with multiple beds, children, illness, guests, or servants generated a great deal of textile work. The cleaner medieval bed, then, was never merely the result of personal virtue. It was the result of resources. A wealthy household could command water carriers, laundresses, servants, fuel, spare linens, and storage. A poorer household might care just as much but have fewer ways to act. This is important because judgments about cleanliness often become judgments about character. In history, they should often be judgments about infrastructure. The same applies to pests. To say a medieval bed had fleas or lice does not mean its owner was unusually neglectful. It means the household lived in a world where pest control was difficult, close contact was common, textiles were precious, animals were near, and regular deep cleaning was labor-intensive. Some households were surely cleaner than others. Some were careless, some careful. But the baseline challenge was structural. That structural challenge shaped sleep in ways that modern people may only grasp when something goes wrong in their own lives. A broken heater, a damp room, a pest problem, a night in an unfamiliar place, a sick child, a power outage, a shared room, an uncomfortable mattress. Medieval people lived with versions of those disruptions not as rare breakdowns, but as ordinary features of domestic life. Their beds were built to help, but not to solve everything. The more we look at the medieval bed, the more it becomes clear that rest was not one thing. It was a layered negotiation with the environment. The sleeper negotiated with cold through blankets and bodies, with damp through elevation and airing, with pests through cleaning and replacement, with smoke through placement and ventilation, with social rank through access to space, with religious fear through prayer, with illness through care, with exhaustion through the simple act of lying down and hoping the night would be kind. That hope may be the most familiar part of the story. Across the centuries, the human body has always looked for relief at the end of the day. A medieval laborer lowering themselves onto a straw-filled sack, a servant curling under a rough cover, a child pressed between siblings for warmth, a merchant settling into a questionable in bed, a noble drawing curtains around a feather mattress. All of them entered the night with some version of the same desire. Let the body stop. Let the cold stay away. Let the itching be less. Let the morning not come too soon. But morning always came. And with morning, the bed's hidden world became visible again in small signs. Bedding to shake, straw to replace, cloth to air, bites to scratch, smoke to smell, stiffness to stretch away, and a household to put back into order. The night's discomfort did not remain in the bed. It followed people into the day, into their work, their tempers, their health, and their sense of what comfort was worth. From there, the story begins to widen beyond insects and bedding, because medieval beds were also shaped by the rooms that held them. A bad bed could become worse in a bad chamber, and even a good mattress could lose its comfort inside a room that was cold, smoky, crowded, damp, or socially exposed. To understand why the bed so often failed, we have to step back from the mattress itself and look at the medieval bedroom, or more often, the medieval sleeping space where architecture, status, and daily life quietly decided how restful the night could ever be. And the medieval sleeping space was rarely a bedroom in the modern, quiet, private sense. For many people, it was simply the part of the house where bodies could be laid down after the day's work was finished. The room that held the bed might also hold tools, food stores, children, animals, chests, benches, clothing, smoke, drying cloth, and the lingering warmth of the hearth. To sleep, there was not to withdraw from household life. It was to rest inside the very machinery of it. This is one of the first things modern viewers have to adjust in their imagination. A medieval house was often organized around function, warmth, and survival before it was organized around privacy. The poorest homes might have only one main room, where cooking, eating, working, socializing, and sleeping all overlapped. Even when there were additional spaces, they were not always specialized in the way we expect. A loft could hold grain, bedding, servants, children, or stored goods. A corner near the fire could become the most desirable place at night. A hall could become a sleeping space after the benches and tables had served their daytime purpose. The bed, therefore, was not only affected by the room, competed with the room. It competed with smoke from the hearth, with drafts from doors and shutters, with damp coming through walls or floors, with stored materials that attracted pests, and with the need to keep the household functioning. A sleeping place might be chosen not because it was peaceful, but because it was the least bad option available. In a small rural home, the hearth was often the emotional and practical center of the interior. It gave warmth, light, and cooked food. It dried damp clothing and gathered people together. But a hearth also changed the air. Smoke could drift before finding its way out through a roof opening, a vent, a hood, or simply through gaps in the structure, depending on the period and the building. A room could be warmer near the fire but smokier, cleaner farther from it but colder. The best sleeping place might depend on the weather, the wind, the fuel, and the household's tolerance for discomfort. This made bedtime a kind of negotiation with the architecture. Sleep too close to the hearth, and the body might endure smoke, sparks, heat, and the risk of restless movement near fire. Sleep too far away, and the cold could settle into the bones. Sleep near the wall, and damp or drafts might trouble the bedding. Sleep near the door, and every movement of people or animals might disturb the night. Sleep in a loft and warmth might rise, but air could be stale, access awkward, and the space cramped. There was often no perfect place, only a hierarchy of compromises. In wealthier homes, the arrangement could be more elaborate, but the same principle remained. A castle, manor, or large urban house might contain chambers, closets, galleries, halls, kitchens, service rooms, and private spaces of varying degrees. Yet even here, the bedchamber was not automatically a silent retreat. The size of the building brought servants, guests, relatives, retainers, and business. Heat had to be managed across large, difficult spaces. Stone walls could be cold. Windows might be shuttered or glazed depending on wealth and period, but they did not create modern insulation. A noble chamber could be impressive and still uncomfortable in winter. The grand hall, especially in earlier medieval elite households, often functioned as a central space where many people ate, worked, waited, and sometimes slept. Higher-ranking members withdrew to more private chambers when those were available, but household life remained layered rather than fully separated. Servants might sleep near their duties. Guests might be placed according to status. Retainers might occupy benches, pallets, or spaces near the hall. The Lord's bed might be removed from the crowd, yet still surrounded by systems of service and access. This means the medieval sleeping space reveals social rank as clearly as clothing or food. Who slept in the chamber? Who slept in the hall? Who slept near the fire? Who had curtains? Who had linen? Who had a locked chest nearby? Who had to share with strangers? Who had to rise before the others? Architecture turned hierarchy into nightly experience. Rank did not disappear when the household lay down. It arranged the darkness. For the poor, lack of space made privacy nearly impossible. A family might share one room because that was the house. Parents, children, elderly relatives, servants, apprentices, and sometimes lodgers could all be within hearing distance. Even when people turned away or pulled covers around themselves, the room remained shared. A whisper could be heard. A cough could wake others. An argument could not be easily hidden. A restless child disturbed everyone. The bed might be intimate, but intimacy was not always chosen. For the wealthy, privacy existed in more complicated ways. A chamber could be more enclosed, better furnished, and physically separate, but the presence of attendants meant that privacy was still managed socially. Servants might enter to tend fires, bring water, prepare garments, open shutters, remove chamber pots, make beds, and attend to the needs of the household. The person with the most luxurious bed might also be the person whose sleeping and waking were woven most visibly into ritual. Comfort was gained, but solitude was not guaranteed. The chamber pot itself reminds us how different the room's functions could be. In a world without indoor plumbing as we know it, nighttime bodily needs had to be handled close to the sleeping area. This was practical, especially in darkness, cold, or danger, but it changed the atmosphere of the room. The sleeping space was not sealed away from waste, illness, or the body's ordinary demands. Servants might empty vessels. Families might manage them themselves. Either way, the bed existed in a room where the human body was fully present, not hidden behind modern systems. In towns, the sleeping space might be squeezed into vertical, busy buildings. A craftsman's household could include a shop below, workrooms, storage, family space, apprentices, and servants. The line between home and workplace could be thin. A weaver, baker, metalworker, tailor, brewer, or merchant did not always leave work behind by entering another district of life. Materials, tools, smells, and schedules entered the household. Sleep took place near production. A bed might be close to wool, flour, leather, barrels, tools, or goods awaiting sale. This had consequences for rest. Work sounds could begin early. Apprentices might sleep lightly, aware of discipline. A household above a shop might wake with street noise, carts, bells, animals, customers, or neighbors. Towns could be crowded and noisy even before modern machinery. Dogs barked, wheels rattled, people shouted, doors opened, bells marked time, fires were watched, markets began. The bed did not float above this world. It was embedded in in rural areas. The noises were different, but not necessarily softer. Animals shifted. Wind moved through thatch. Rain struck roofs. Cattle, pigs, chickens, dogs, and horses made their own sounds depending on the household and season. A storm could make a poor roof feel suddenly fragile. A winter wind could press against walls. In summer, insects and early dawn could disturb sleep. Silence, when it came, may have been deep, but it was not empty. It was filled with the awareness of weather, animals, and the vulnerability of the home. The structure of the house mattered enormously. A well-built timber house, a stone manor, a wattle and daub cottage, an urban row house, a castle chamber, a monastic dormitory, and an inn-room all created different nights. But across many of them, the same problems appeared in different forms. Keeping warmth in, letting smoke out, keeping damp away, controlling pests, creating enough separation between bodies, and managing the daily transformation of space. A bed against a wall might seem cozy, but walls could be cold. A bed in the center of a room might be warmer, but it used precious space and exposed the sleeper to movement. Curtains could create enclosure, but they also created maintenance. A loft could remove the sleeper from the floor, but smoke and heat might collect above. A hall could offer warmth from a central fire, but it also brought people noise and low privacy. Every location had its price. This is why medieval beds were often surrounded by practical objects. Chests held clothing, linens, valuables, or household goods. Pegs and rails held garments. Benches could become sleeping surfaces. Stools, tables, and storage vessels filled the same room. In a world where possessions were fewer but deeply useful, space was rarely ornamental. The bed was part of a crowded map of necessity. And because the room was crowded, the bed could never be completely clean in the modern sense. Dust, ash, fibers, food crumbs, mud, hair, wool, straw fragments, and the traces of animals and people moved through the interior. Even careful households fought against constant reintroduction. The door opened and the outside came in. Fuel came in. Food came in. Shoes came in. Tools came in. Children came in. The bed lay waiting for the room to settle, but the room never settled for long. Light shaped the sleeping space as much as warmth did. Medieval interiors could be dim, especially in poorer homes or in winter. Windows were smaller, coverings were practical, and artificial light cost resources. Candles, rushlights, lamps, and the hearth all gave light of different quality, but none turned night into day. Preparing for bed required working within fading light. Finding a dropped object, checking bedding, tending a child, or dealing with sickness could become more difficult after dark. The bed was not only less comfortable, it was harder to manage. Darkness also changed movement. Crossing a room at night could mean stepping around bodies, furniture, animals, embers, tools, or stored goods. In a crowded household, one person rising could disturb several others. A servant might move quietly to avoid waking the household. A mother might tend a child in near darkness. Someone older might move carefully to avoid falling. The sleeping space was a landscape that had to be remembered by touch and habit. For those in monasteries or communal religious settings, the architecture of sleep could be deliberately disciplined. Dormitories placed bodies in ordered relation to one another. Beds or pallets might be arranged with rules of conduct, modesty, and obedience. The space was not private because privacy was not the purpose. Sleep was part of a regulated life. Night offices interrupted rest. Bells summoned bodies out of beds into prayer. Here, the discomfort was not only material but institutional. The bed served devotion as much as the body. This shows again that the medieval bed cannot be understood apart from the system around it. In a peasant home, the system was survival and labor. In a town workshop, it was production and household economy. In a noble chamber, it was hierarchy and display. In a monastery, it was discipline and prayer. In an inn, it was travel and uncertainty. The same human need for sleep passed through all these systems and came out differently shaped. The medieval room also carried ideas about safety. A bed near others could mean crowding, but it also meant protection. In a world where night travel was dangerous, where theft or violence could be feared, where fire and illness were real concerns, being alone was not always desirable. A shared room allowed people to hear trouble. A child near parents was easier to protect. A servant near a door could guard or respond. A household sleeping in proximity could be practical, not merely backward. This is one of the useful reversals in the story. Modern people often equate privacy with comfort, and in many ways it is. But medieval comfort could also mean not being isolated. Warmth came from bodies. Safety came from proximity. Care came from hearing one another. A person sleeping alone in a cold outbuilding might have had more privacy, but less comfort and less security. The crowded sleeping space was a hardship, yet sometimes also a protection. That contradiction appeared in the curtain bed as well. Curtains created privacy, but they also created warmth and safety. They marked status, but they also solved drafts. They could hide the sleeper, but they could also make the air close. They were beautiful, practical, and problematic all at once. Like so much medieval furniture, the curtain bed was not a simple luxury. It was a technology built from cloth. The cloth mattered because walls could not do all the work. If a room was too large, too cold, or too drafty, fabric could create a smaller room inside it. Tapestries on walls, hangings around beds, curtains over openings, and layered textiles all helped soften the harshness of architecture. The wealthy used cloth to warm space visually and physically, but cloth absorbed smoke, odors, damp, and dust. It needed cleaning and care. The solution carried the seed of the next problem. Poorer households used simpler versions of the same logic. A cloak, blanket, hanging cloth, or screen might create a little division. A family might arrange bedding to block drafts. A child might be placed between adults. Straw might thicken the floor. The principle was the same. When architecture could not provide comfort, people used materials, bodies, and habit to create it. This practical creativity deserves attention. Medieval people were not passive victims of bad housing. They adapted constantly. They shifted beds by season. They aired bedding. They placed sleepers according to warmth and need. They used curtains, chests, screens, mats, rushes, and fire. They developed routines around darkness. They knew which corner was coldest and which blanket scratched least. They knew how the room behaved in rain, frost, and wind. The discomfort was real, but so was the intelligence used to manage it. Still, intelligence could not eliminate poverty. A household without enough room could not invent space. A family without dry textiles could not air rain-soaked bedding into freshness. A servant with a poor sleeping place could not choose the best chamber. A traveler in a crowded inn could not demand modern sanitation. A noble in a cold stone building could improve the bed but not change the season. Material limits remained stubborn. The room also shaped emotional life. A crowded sleeping space made private grief difficult. It made marital tension harder to hide. It made childhood fear more communal. It made sickness more visible. It made fatigue contagious. If one person suffered through a fever, others knew. If one person cried quietly, someone might hear. If one person could not sleep, the movements might disturb others. The room turned individual discomfort into household atmosphere. This could create compassion, could also create irritation. A restless sleeper, a crying infant, an ill relative, or an old person needing attention could stretch patience thin. The bed, which we imagine as a symbol of rest, could become a center of pressure. It held the people most in need of care, but also demanded care from those already exhausted. In this way, the medieval sleeping space reveals the emotional economy of the household. Who gave rest to others, and who lost rest in doing so. Gender mattered here, especially in the labor around beds. Women were often responsible for much of the domestic work that made sleep possible. Washing, airing, mending, arranging, tending children, caring for the sick, managing linens, and maintaining order around the sleeping space. Servants and lower-status women could bear much of the heaviest work in wealthier homes. The comfort of one body often rested on the tiredness of another. A clean bed might look peaceful, but its peace had been produced. Men sleep, women sleep, children sleep, servants sleep, and the sleep of the elderly could all be valued differently within the household's demands. A man expected for heavy field labor might need rest, but so did the woman who rose to bake, brew, nurse, wash, or manage animals. A servant might sleep less because their work framed everyone else's day. A child might sleep in fragments. An elderly person might need warmth but receive whatever space could be spared. Rest was not distributed equally. At the same time, we should avoid imagining every medieval household as loveless or cruel. Families cared for one another. People made sacrifices. A mother might pull a child closer for warmth. A husband and wife might share the best cover. A servant might be given a better place in a humane household. A grandparent might be settled near the hearth. Hospitality could be generous. The same conditions that created discomfort also created dependence, and dependence could produce tenderness. This mixture of hardship and care is part of what makes the medieval bed so revealing. It was a place where social structures became physical. Class became mattress quality. Gender became laundry and night care. Age became placement near warmth. Rank became privacy. Wealth became fresh linen. Poverty became shared straw. But affection could bend these patterns. Fear could rearrange them. Illness could overturn them. The bed was structured by society, yet lived by human beings. By late evening, the room began its transformation again. Work slowed or changed form. Tools were put aside. Food vessels were cleared or moved. Embers were managed. Children were gathered. Animals were checked. Doors were secured. Bedding was pulled out, unfolded, shaken, or entered. The household that had been vertical and busy became horizontal and vulnerable. The same space took a different shape in the dark. This nightly transformation must have been one of the most familiar rituals of medieval domestic life. It did not need ceremony to matter. It happened through repeated gestures. Pulling a cover over a child, adjusting straw, closing a shutter, drawing a curtain, banking a fire, placing a pot, removing shoes, loosening a belt, setting aside a tool, whispering a prayer. The bed appeared not as an isolated object, but as the final arrangement of the day. And once everyone lay down, the room did not vanish. Pressed close, the sleeper could feel the uneven surface beneath, hear breathing nearby, smell smoke in the cloth, sense the cold at the edge of the covers, and know that beyond the bed, the rest of the room remained full of objects, obligations, and risks. Sleep came not because the world had become peaceful, but because the body could no longer keep watch over all of it. There is something almost humbling in that. Medieval people did not require perfect conditions to sleep. They slept because they had to. The body took what rest it could find. A bed could be rough, crowded, smoky, and imperfect, and still become the most welcome place in the house because the day had been harder than the night. Comfort was relative. A bad bed after a brutal day could feel better than no bed at all. But the consequences accumulated. A poor sleeping space could mean waking stiff, cold, bitten, unrest, or irritable. Could affect labor, attention, patience, and health. A servant who slept poorly still had to serve. A field worker who woke sore still had to bend over the soil. A mother who had been awake with a child still had to manage the morning. A monk roused for prayer still had to follow the bell. Bad sleep did not pause medieval life. It became part of the burden people carried through it. And that burden leads us toward another side of the story, the strange relationship between beds, status, and display. Because while many medieval people struggled simply to create a tolerable sleeping space, others turned beds into some of the most impressive objects in the household. They carved them, curtained them, inventoried them, inherited them, presented them to guests, and used them to express rank. Yet the more a bed became a symbol, the more it revealed a deeper contradiction. The object most associated with private vulnerability could also become one of the loudest public statements a medieval household could make. That contradiction became especially visible in wealthy homes, where the bed was no longer just a place to recover from the day, but a carefully arranged sign of power, taste, inheritance, and belonging. A great bed could dominate a chamber the way a throne dominated a hall. Its carved posts, curtains, hangings, coverlets, pillows, and fine linen announced that the household possessed not only money, but stability. It had the resources to soften cold, to command labor, to store textiles, to welcome guests properly, and to separate important bodies from the discomforts that pressed so closely on everyone else. Yet even here, the bed remained strangely honest. It could display rank, but it could not hide the fact that every person, however powerful, had to lie down. The grandest lord, the richest merchant, the most carefully attended noblewoman, and the highest ruler still entered the same human condition once the curtains closed. The body became tired, the room grew cold, the night stretched, illness could arrive, dreams could trouble the mind. A great bed could make vulnerability more beautiful, more comfortable, and more ceremonial, but it could not remove vulnerability itself. This is why medieval beds were so often treated as valuable possessions. They were not merely useful. They represented a victory over the discomforts of the age, even when that victory was incomplete. A fine featherbed meant distance from the floor. Linen meant cleanliness made visible. Curtains meant warmth and separation. Carved wood meant permanence. Extra blankets meant stored security against winter. To own such things was to own a small defense against the world. For the poor, the same desire appeared in simpler form. A fresh layer of straw, a dry blanket, a warmer place near the hearth, a shared cover on a freezing night, a sack mended before the stuffing spilled out. These were not small comforts to the people who depended on them. They were forms of survival. The difference between a miserable night and a bearable one might be narrow, but within that narrow space lived a great deal of human effort. Across medieval society, then, the bed measured the distance between need and possibility. Everyone needed sleep. Not everyone could afford comfort. Everyone wanted warmth. Not everyone could control cold. Everyone wanted cleanliness. Not everyone had water, fuel, spare linen, time, or servants. Everyone wanted some degree of privacy. Not everyone had walls, doors, curtains, or enough room. The bed exposed inequality in the most intimate possible way, through the conditions under which people rested their bodies. And still, we should be careful not to flatten the past into misery. Medieval people did not experience their beds only as failures. They knew relief. They knew the pleasure of lying down after exhausting labor. They knew the comfort of warmth gathered under covers while wind moved outside. They knew the value of familiar bedding, the smell of fresh straw, the softness of wool, the shelter of a roof, the quiet after a household settled, the closeness of family in winter, and the deep sleep that comes when the body has worked to its limit. A modern viewer might look at a medieval bed and see only hardship. A medieval person might look at the same bed and see one of the most important possessions in the house. Both perspectives can be true, because comfort is always judged against expectation. A bed that seems rough to us might have been precious to them. A chamber that seems smoky, crowded, and cold to us might still have been safer than the road, warmer than the outside, and more dignified than bare ground. That is one of the quiet lessons of this history. The medieval bed was worse than we think, not because people in the past were incapable of comfort, but because comfort itself was harder to produce. It required wood, cloth, straw, wool, feathers, labor, dry weather, managed fire, household order, and social permission. It required a roof that held, a room that could be warmed, bedding that could be cleaned, and enough space to lie down without being constantly disturbed. What we often receive through hidden systems they had to build by hand, maintain by routine, and negotiate every night. The bed also reminds us that the Middle Ages were not lived only in the dramatic places we tend to remember. History did not happen only in castles, churches, battlefields, courts and marketplaces. It happened in the dark interior of ordinary houses, where people pulled rough covers over sore bodies and hoped for a few hours of rest. It happened in inns where travelers lay beside strangers. It happened in monastic dormitories where bells divided the night. It happened in noble chambers where curtains enclosed both privilege and anxiety. It happened in poor cottages where a family's warmth depended on closeness. The ordinary bed brings the medieval world down to the level of skin, breath, cloth, and cold air. It shows us history not as a sequence of events, but as a set of conditions people had to physically endure. What did the room smell like? How dry was the bedding? Who else was lying nearby? Was the fire still alive? Were there insects in the straw? Would the baby wake? Would the master call before dawn? Would the road be safer tomorrow after one night under a roof? These questions rarely appear in grand historical timelines, but they shaped the lives inside those timelines. And the deeper we look, the more the bed becomes a kind of quiet map. It maps class because wealth determines softness, privacy, and cleanliness. It maps labor because someone had to wash, air, mend, beat, gather, stuff, fold, and prepare. It maps gender because much of that invisible work fell to women and servants. It maps age because children, the elderly, and the sick needed warmth and care in different ways. It maps belief because prayer, dreams, morality, and vulnerability gathered around sleep. It maps architecture because walls, floors, hearths, windows, and roofs decided what kind of night was possible. Most of all, it maps dependence. No one slept entirely alone in the medieval world, even when they had a room to themselves. The sleeper depended on the household, on the season, on animals, on servants or family members, on fuel, on harvests, on textiles, on carpenters, on laundresses, on weather, on health, and on the small, fragile success of keeping the outside world from entering too strongly. The bed was personal, but its comfort was communal. That may be why it carried so much meaning in wills, inventories, marriages, hospitality, and household memory. A bed could be inherited because it was expensive, but also because it had belonged to a life. It had supported sleep, birth, sickness, intimacy, worry, recovery, and death. It had been warmed by bodies now gone. It had been repaired because it mattered. It had been moved, displayed, shared, guarded, and remembered. In a world of fewer possessions, such an object was never just an object. By the late Middle Ages and into the centuries that followed, sleeping spaces would continue to change. Domestic architecture would grow more specialized for some groups. Beds would become more elaborate in elite settings. Urban life, trade, textiles, household privacy, and ideas of comfort would keep developing. But the medieval bed remained part of a longer human story. The slow attempt to make nights safer, warmer, cleaner, softer, and more private than it had been before. That attempt did not move evenly. It did not reach everyone at once. The wealthy gained curtains and feather beds while the poor still refreshed straw. Some people slept behind hangings while others slept near animals. Some inherited fine linens while others patched rough covers. Some were attended in chambers while others rose before dawn from a pallet in a workspace. Progress in comfort was never simply technological. It was social. It depended on who could afford the technology, who maintained it, and who was allowed to benefit from it. So when we imagine a medieval bed, we should resist both extremes. It was not always a filthy heap of straw, and it was not a romantic curtained refuge from a storybook. It was usually something more complicated. A practical attempt to solve problems that had no perfect solution. It could be beautiful and uncomfortable, valuable and unhygienic, warm and stale, shared and lonely, soft and unhealthy, private-looking and socially exposed. It was one of the most revealing objects in the medieval home because it carried contradictions without resolving them. And perhaps that is why the subject stays with us. A bed is familiar. We know what it means to be tired. We know what it feels like when sleep is broken, when a room is too cold, when a mattress hurts, when noise will not stop, when worries continue after the lights go out. Those experiences give us a narrow bridge into the past. They do not make us medieval, but they help us understand that history was lived through bodies much like ours, trying to rest under conditions very different from ours. The next time we picture medieval life, it may be useful to picture not only the castle wall or the village field, but the moment after dark when the day's work had finally ended. The hearth has sunk low. The room is dim. Someone has drawn a curtain. Someone has shaken out a blanket. A child has been moved closer to warmth. A traveler has accepted a shared bed because the road outside is worse. A servant has curled into a narrow place, knowing the morning will come early. A noble has settled beneath fine fabric, still not entirely free from cold, insects, illness, or worry. In that moment, the medieval bed becomes both ordinary and profound. It is where the human body asks history for mercy. Sometimes history gives a feather mattress, linen sheets, and a curtained chamber. Sometimes it gives straw, smoke, and a shared blanket near the floor. Sometimes it gives enough warmth to survive, but not enough quiet to rest. Sometimes it gives the body a few deep hours before dawn, and sometimes even that is more than the day before allowed. What medieval beds show us, finally, is that comfort is never just comfort. It is built from labor, wealth, technology, climate, architecture, social order, and care. It is also deeply fragile. A roof leak, a cold night, an illness, an infestation, a shortage of straw, or one extra body in the room could change everything. The medieval bed was worse than many people think because the world around it made sleep difficult. But it was also more meaningful than many people think, because in that difficult world, even imperfect rest mattered enormously. So the story of medieval beds is not only a story of discomfort. It is a story of human adaptation. People did what they could with the materials they had. They raised beds from floors, hung curtains against drafts, shared warmth, aired linens, changed straw, used herbs, tightened ropes, passed down bedding, welcomed guests, cared for the sick, and tried again each night. Their beds were not modern sanctuaries. They were small, handmade negotiations with hardship. And as the last sounds of the medieval household faded into darkness, that negotiation became quiet. The tools stopped moving. The hearth glowed. The animals settled. Curtains hung still. Straw rustled under tired backs. Breath slowed in the cold air. Somewhere in the room, someone slept deeply. Someone else only half slept, listening. And for a few fragile hours, before labor, hunger, bells, weather, and duty returned, the bed held the medieval body as gently as its world allowed. If one detail from the story stayed with you, I'd be interested to know what it was. The insects, the cold, the lack of privacy, the strange value of bedding, or the way even a beautiful bed could hide so much discomfort. And if you enjoy calm, thoughtful journeys into the quieter side of history, you're warmly invited to subscribe and return for the next one. History often feels most real not in its loudest moments, but in the ordinary places where people tried to live, rest, and begin again.